Hello and welcome again to the doctor's office. On this episode, we're going to be talking about testing for COVID-19 and everything that goes along with it. Stay tuned. Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Ben. I'm an emergency physician practicing in the Midwest, United States. It's a pleasure for me to be able to talk to you on YouTube regarding these important issues regarding COVID-19. This is one part in a multi-part series where I go over different facets of COVID-19. In this episode specifically, we're going to be talking about testing. So first up, who should be tested for COVID-19? So this question can have a few layers of answers. I'm going to go over the optimal strategy for testing, which is if you have one or more symptoms of COVID-19, and I'm going to refer back to my previous episode: cough, congestion, fever, headache, sore throat, loss of taste or smell, nausea, diarrhea, things that that in a constellation together think like, this is a common cold or maybe a little bit more than a common cold. If you're having those symptoms, you should get tested. Another reason you should be tested is if you are in close contact with someone who has COVID-19, like within 6 feet, or live with someone who has COVID-19 and spent a total of 15 minutes around them, you should consider getting tested, particularly if you start showing symptoms. And then lastly, anyone who has been referred for testing through the local health department or their primary care physician or physician team should be tested. Now, this is the ideal situation, meaning the testing in your area has enough tests to run. And currently, that's kind of a not so sure thing. Different parts of the country are running out of testing supplies due to this second surge, which is hitting us right now. So what you should do will vary a little bit region by region. I would say if you're showing symptoms of COVID-19, and again, refer back to that previous video, I'll link down below, I would get tested. Next up, how do you get tested for COVID-19? What does that entail? We've all seen the lines of the cars on the news going through, and then the people are like leaning their head back and something goes in there and you're like, what in the world is going on? So there are two major types of tests for the COVID-19 virus. One is the antigen test and one is the molecular test. I'll talk about the antigen test first. The antigen test is the rapid test, if you've ever heard that. It's a test where they are trying to pick up specific parts of the COVID-19 virus's body. Now I'll show on the screen that classic picture everyone's seen of the COVID-19 virus, which is a electron microscope picture, which, by the way, those pictures come out colorless, so we just color them in. We're saying that the spikes are the red parts, but in reality we have no idea what color it is. So the coronavirus is a sphere of fat molecules, and on the surface of them are little spikes. And those spikes are things that help the coronavirus attack cells and get inside cells, navigate their way through the body. It's pretty complicated, even for me, a simple emergency department doctor. Those are proteins, though. And those proteins we can pick up if they're in a high enough concentration in someone's nose. And that's what that rapid test is. It's a nasal swab, taking something about the size of a Q-tip. In some places, it's a little bit smaller than a Q-tip. Hopefully you're in one of those places when you get tested. But you take that and you put it into the back of the nose, which sounds uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable. It's not murderous. You're going to make it through it, I promise you. I've had it done myself. I've had COVID. But it's not something where you're like, oh man, I can't wait to get my COVID test today. This is going to be great. I'm going to feel so good. No, it's going to make your eyes water. You're going to feel uncomfortable. They're going to hold it back there for a few seconds and then pull it out. And that's it. Done deal. The reason it has to be through the nose is because the coronavirus concentrates in the nasopharynx. It's the easiest place for us to pick it up. The saliva it's in the saliva, although in a lower concentration, so it's harder to pick up in the saliva. There are saliva tests, but honestly, I don't think it's as good as the nasal swab, at least currently. So then on this flip side of that is the molecular test. That test is commonly referred to as a PCR test. PCR standing for polymerase chain reaction, which is, again, something that a geneticist would know a whole lot about. I know a little bit about, having been through medical school. But what it's doing is it's trying to pick up the virus's genetics. Inside that fatty body of the virus, that sphere, is a complex set of proteins and then RNA, which is the genetics of the virus. A PCR test is going to try to take that RNA, the genetics of the virus, multiply it thousands and thousands and thousands fold in an exponential reaction until it's just an abundance of these RNA molecules that we can then test for and determine if you have COVID-19. This also is a nasal swab typically. I've heard that it can be a saliva swab. I've never seen it be a saliva swab, but I've heard that that's a thing. But by and far, the most common way to test for this is a nasal sample. And this is considered the gold standard because if you can pick up a genetic sample, that's how you tell it's really that thing. You know, like in the CSI shows, it's always, we got to find his DNA, and if we get his DNA match, then we'll get it. We'll be sure it's the killer, and that's true because DNA is so highly specific for an individual person. COVID has RNA. Some viruses have DNA, but COVID is one that has RNA. And you can think of DNA as the double helix winding. Probably the number one way you've seen this is if you ever watched Jurassic Park, and there's that stupid little molecule that's like, "Hey guys, welcome to the park." That thing is a DNA sample. Now, if you were to cut the spiral in half, so it's a twining strand, that's an RNA particle. And that's what the COVID virus has, and that's what we pick up. What test is a better test? Difficult question. Testing characteristics of these tests vary widely depending on the make of the testing kit and the machine that's running it. So it's really, unfortunately, it's too complicated a question. It's not straightforward enough to where I can answer it for you definitively. I will say that the gold standard is that PCR test, the molecular test. How long does it take to run a COVID-19 test? Great question. The PCR test takes on the matter of days to run because, as it sounds, we're trying to replicate exponentially a virus's genetic material, which is more complicated. That takes some time to run. The rapid test can be run within about half an hour to an hour. Although, caveat here, labs often batch these tests, meaning they'll wait for 100 or 1,000 tests to come in before they run them all together, which saves overall equipment and lab tech time and things like that. So even though, under best case scenario, it could be run in half an hour, typically that will take about a day for the public as well, unless you're in a large hospital setting. Can you see COVID-19 under a microscope? Can't you just take a swab and then look under the microscope and see it? Yes, but only under an electron microscope, which is a very specific type of microscope. And even then, that requires a very specific type of staining and handling and freezing in order to be able to look at that. It's much more specialized than you would just find at like a high school chemistry microscope. A microscope like you would find in a chemistry class or even in a basic medical school class would not be able to see a virus. A virus is so small it's hard to even fathom. A single particle is between 50 and 200 nanometers in diameter. Compare that to an average animal or human cell, which is 10 micrometers in diameter. It means that the coronavirus is up to 200 times or even more smaller than an animal cell or a basic human red blood cell. If you've seen, microscope shots of blood cells, they're very small, and those are on very good microscopes. So you can imagine a virus particle, you just can't see it on a basic microscope, which means that we can't just take your saliva or your blood and then take a look under the microscope and see it. It's just not practical. Antibody testing. What is antibody testing, and how is it performed? How is it different than other tests? So antibody testing is testing for antibodies. Antibodies are particles, proteins in the human body that circulate and fight infection, and they're typically specific for a certain type of infection. So in other words, if I were to get influenza, over time my body would start to recognize that virus in my body and start to produce these particles which attach to the influenza virus particle and tell my body that that's a bad foreign invader, and then my cells will then destroy the virus. It takes time for your body to build those antibodies. It's not a quick process, which is why viruses take time for your body to heal. So when we test for antibodies, we're testing for the things that our own body is making in response to an infection. For COVID-19, that's no different. We're typically testing for two different types of antibodies. IgG, which is a long-acting antibody, and IgM, which is a short-acting antibody. These are picked up in a blood sample. So this is the difference between the test that actually tests for the virus and the test that tests for antibodies. The antibody test is a blood test. It means that the antibody test is the test to tell, have I had COVID-19? That's the bottom line. The antibody test is the test to say, I've had COVID-19 in the past and I've recovered from it. Do I need a chest x-ray to diagnose COVID-19? No, you do not need a chest x-ray to diagnose COVID-19. Although practitioners will commonly use chest x-rays if they are concerned about how your lungs sound when they examine you, or your vital signs, or how you appear to them. And that's to take a look at and to see, number one, is COVID-19 impacting your lungs in a significant manner? What's the appearance of your lungs? Are they getting enough oxygen in? Are they filled with junk? Or two, sometimes COVID-19 can sound like other things, meaning you have a cough, you have a fever. Do you have a bacterial pneumonia? And that's something a chest x-ray is great at diagnosing and can help tell those things apart, because if it's a bacterial pneumonia, you need antibiotics. What happens after I get tested? First, you should go home and home quarantine. If you don't know the results of a test and you know that you have an indication to be tested, the safest thing for you to do is to stay at home and be home quarantined. And that means staying at home at all times unless you absolutely have to go out for things like needing medical care. One of my other videos talks about the length of home quarantine. In short, for a person who's has a normal immune system, it's 10 days from the start of symptoms, and that can extend longer if you're continuing to have fevers or if you're getting worse in any way, and that's current CDC guidelines. Now, if that test becomes positive, you're under that timetable, meaning you have to stay home for 10 days or longer if you're still having fevers or still getting worse. If your test is negative, technically our testing is showing that you don't have COVID and you can go about your daily activities. Although I will say I would want you to be very cautious, because there is a chance that you have a false negative, which means that the test is negative, but you actually have COVID. That actually happened to my wife. I gave it to her. And her first test was negative, but then she continued to get worse, and her second test was positive then. That's a known thing that can happen. So if you're showing multiple symptoms of COVID-19, you don't feel well, I would say even with a negative test, you should home quarantine for that 10-day period. Other things you should do after you've been tested: wear a mask at all times. Wash your hands vigorously as often as you can, particularly if you're touching surfaces that other people touch. Try to stay away from other people you're in contact with in your home, which includes spouses, children. Have them wear a mask around you, which sounds, I know, a little strange, but mask wearing is starting to become more common. Your family will get it. It's because you're trying to protect them. Cover your cough or sneezes with your elbow, ideally. And then clean and disinfect all surfaces that you commonly touch: doorknobs, countertops, sinks, parts of the bathroom, things like that. And then if you're blessed enough to have a spare bedroom, try to sleep in a separate place from your spouse or anyone else who you might share a bedroom with. Finally, if I test positive, should I go to the hospital? So no, the answer is no, with a big asterisk here. Just because you have COVID-19 does not mean that you need to go to the hospital. Unless you're exhibiting emergency signs or symptoms, I would say no, you do not need to go to the hospital. And I talked about this in my previous video, but things that would make me think that COVID-19 is progressing if you're positive to more of an emergency state where you need emergent medical care, or at bare minimum should call your primary care physician, are if you're becoming short of breath, you have blue discoloration around the lips or the hands, if you are confused in any way, if you're having trouble waking up, or if you have chest pressure. Those are things where I'd want you to get immediate emergency care. Other than that, it's a virus. It takes time for your body to heal. Take this seriously. COVID-19 is really going to put you down. I would say call work, tell them you're COVID positive. I'm sure your work does not want you going into work being COVID positive. Try to get one of your loved ones to help you stock up on things that will help you get through this, meaning things like Pedialyte or Gatorade for fluids, broths, chicken noodle soup, bananas, applesauce, rice, and toast, things that will help your gastrointestinal system not be upset, because COVID-19 can affect your GI tract. And then the other thing that I'm recommending people get if they become positive for COVID-19 is a home pulse oximeter, and I'll link the one that I recommend down below. But in short, it's a device that fits on the tip of your finger, and it measures your oxygen level in your blood. And if that is properly reading, it will give you a good measurement of how much oxygen your body is getting. And it's a percentage on a scale of 0%, which I've never seen in a live human being, to 100%. The average human is typically in the upper 90s to mid 90s. If you have conditions like COPD, it might be lower to that, in the lower 90s. If your oxygen saturation is consistently less than 90%, you need to come to the hospital. So that concludes this episode of The Doctor's Office. I hope you learned something about testing. As always, it's a great pleasure for having you watch me. If you haven't already, subscribe and like below, which will help this video get out to others and help boost me in YouTube's algorithm. Until next time, stay happy, healthy, informed, and empowered.